feminist epistemology, in a sense, isn't really its own discipline, in that if epistemology had been done better, feminist epistemology wouldn't need to exist. As feminist epistemology critiques this sort of standard conception of knowledge and knowing and knowers that we've been working with for like at least a few centuries now. And that's a tradition that comes primarily out of Descartes, although Descartes wasn't necessarily the progenitor of it. It's this idea that it's like a monastic notion of knowers, that like the paradigm example of someone acquiring knowledge is someone operating entirely self-sufficiently without relying on things like emotions and these other like contingency features of their person, but relying just on their rational faculties, sort of faculties of their minds and their reason, to, in isolation, self-sufficiently arrive at a justified belief. And justified here in the sense of being like indubitable. Something that couldn't be doubted. And feminist epistemology emerges when we realize that like that model is just no good. Like it's not, it doesn't really tell us anything about us and ourselves as epistemic agents.
It doesn't seem to give the whole story of the human experience. Like you want to account for the experiences that you're also feeling as you're going through the world. Not just like am I just like a thinking machine, or like is there no reason to analyze what I'm actually feeling? Can I just like interpret everything, and then interpretation is everything then?
Good, yeah, exactly. So that's like the first point of challenge on this kind of like, in class we were calling it like the atomistic conception of knowers. There's lots of ways of referring to it. And that's like the first point of critique of it is like, you know, I'm not actually this like computational, like rational belief forming process. Like, so when I move around the world, like a lot of my experiences are emotional experiences. They're like, you know, what we would call irrational experiences. And yet they're a part of my epistemic life. They're a part of my epistemic agency. You know, I care about trans issues, and so I'm more motivated to learn about those issues. And so there's you know, my emotions are propelling me along a kind of epistemic path, but they also, you know, serve their own epistemic role. You know, I feel like, I don't know, if I'm angry at my partner, then like that's actually telling me something about what's happened between us. So the first point of critique of standard epistemology is just that we're not perfectly rational, and our quote-unquote irrationality seems to play a part in our epistemic lives. And then the second point of critique is that we are socially epistemic. That the ways in which we actually come to learn things, have beliefs and whatnot, are the result of social processes. And they said, like, you know, teaching feminist epistemology in a university class is just a really nice way of demonstrating this. Like, you know, in order to learn feminist epistemology, you guys are having to show up to my lectures, you're having to listen to me, you're having to do the readings that I assign you, you're having to talk with each other, you're having to go to discussion sections, you're having to come to office hours, you're having to do peer review exercises. These are all ways in which your knowledge is social. And, you know, maybe I could devise a course where like no one talks to anyone, no one comes to my office hours, and somehow the readings just like fall from the sky. But, you know, when we look at how we actually learn things, we learn them in a social way. And then feminist epistemologists further come in to say, like, well, let's explore how these social factors affect the epistemic factors. Like, how do our social lives affect our epistemic lives? How do they affect them positively, and how do they affect them negatively? That's really, as I see it at least, that's the purview of feminist philosophy.
All of the things that we've talked about so far seems to like point towards this this unity that I tried to mention, like this ultimate absolute truth that you can no longer doubt, but then also it's not reachable because there's like both experience and your own intuitions about what your experiences mean.
Yeah.
And so would you say then that feminist epistemology is trying to take experience without interpretation, or is there like an interpretation intrinsic to feminist epistemology as well?
Yeah, good question. So I certainly think that feminist epistemology is interested in the interpretations of experiences. I don't know that I would describe feminist epistemology as having a particular lens of interpretation. I mean, it sort of does in the sense of like its lens of interpretation is like patriarchy. How.
But that's not the goal. It seems that's like a sort of effect, and it's hard to like. It's hard for some people to maybe like distinguish which is like what is what, or like what causes what.
Yeah, indeed. That's right. Yeah. So there's a certain kind of artificiality here insofar as like, well, feminist epistemology is like, well, we're going to use this lens and this kind of like mode of interpretation, even acknowledging that like, there are other modes of interpretation that one could take. One can look at, one can do epistemology from like a black perspective, or from a trans perspective, or from a indigenous perspective, or, all of these kinds of perspectives. In that sense, I think feminist epistemology is a sort of misnomer. Certainly in our course, we've mostly been looking at like the lens of patriarchy, but we've also looked at like a racialized lens. This week we've been looking at like an indigenous lens, which is why I describe feminist epistemology as just like, it's about the social relations making a difference to the epistemic relations. But then, there's this question of like, well, we've got all these lenses of interpretation. Does the lens, do we transcend the lens?
Yeah.
Do we ever get outside the perspective of this lens of interpretation? And I think there's a pessimistic, skeptical answer that sort of says no. At least in the sense of like, we're always going to be assessing under some perspective, under some framework of assumptions. So like, maybe we can like get out of a feminist lens and switch to an indigenous lens. Like, okay, cool. And maybe we can use the indigenous lens to critique the feminist lens. Great. But then we're just in the indigenous lens.
Still in a lens.
Exactly. And if we wanted to get out of the indigenous lens, well, we're just going to move to another lens. You have to adopt
another one, yeah.
Exactly, yeah. So I sort of think that's just a feature of
the
how we
condition.
are. Exactly. Like that's just we can't abstract out of ourselves. All we can do is adopt different critical perspectives. But then I also think that in that is a sort of like hope and the sort of like sense that it's going to be okay. As I was saying in the previous chat, like, we can address these kinds of skeptical questions of, because what the issue of like always being in a lens kind of like leads us to these questions of like, are we just like in a simulation? Are we in the Matrix? Are we all dreaming? Are we all like, is there any way in which we can know that we know? Like, is there any way that we can like objectively verify the truth of our experiences? And I don't think that there is. I think we will never be able to address those kinds of global skeptical arguments. And I think engaging with the global skeptical arguments and the ways in which we're always in a perspective are really useful. They play an important role in thinking about justification and the limits of theory and all this other stuff. And then I think once we've got those insights from those questions, we can set them aside. Yeah. Because it's very obvious that we have knowledge.
Yeah, because they're useless.
But that's it, they don't actually tell us anything about our epistemic lives. Our day-to-day lives. Like, they tell us something about the limits of our assumptions, maybe. But they don't tell us anything about our epistemic lives. And moreover, it does seem like global skepticism is full. Like, it does seem like we know things. I mean, the example I used is like, you sent me an email with your address, and I read the email, and I successfully turned up here. Shocker, things go relatively okay for us.
Mm-hmm.
Not all of, obviously there's a huge span of different kinds of experiences within that range. Like, not everything goes okay for everyone, and, there are all sorts of failures and whatnot. But generally, we can use our beliefs to successfully arrive at our goals.
Yeah.
And that would suggest a kind of knowledge. And then really what we want to be interested in there, I think, is just like, okay, well, how do we do that? Like, what are the processes that we engage in that enable us to be more successful?
Mm-hmm.
And what are the processes that we engage in that prevent us from being successful?
Yeah. Okay, that's a good answer, I think, for feminist epistemology. Okay, so how would you define gender identity? It's another question.
Yeah, good. So just to like contextualize this, so gender identity is the topic of my PhD research, and is what I'm writing my thesis on. So I'm trying to give an account of what gender identity is. So this is very much the thing that I've been thinking about for like the last 7 years or so. And there's a couple of ways to get into my answer of what gender identity is. And the first way I like to get into the answer is just to ask you, like, how would you describe your gender? And, sort of hear me, like, are you a man? Are you a woman? Are you something else?
Yeah, that would be like the most basic answer that I can give, like, without thinking about it too much. Now that I've taken your lecture, I think I can think more critically about it, of course. But I would, if I hadn't taken your lecture, I'd just go like, like, I'm a guy,
mm-hmm.
right? Like,
yeah. And so, in the first instance, my view of gender identity is, I think gender identity is whatever prompts you to answer that question in the way in which you answer it.
Mm-hmm.
So, it's for you, it's whatever makes you say, I'm a guy. For me, it's whatever makes me say I'm non-binary or trans femme. And that can be anything. Obviously, the classic example that, like, most people are probably familiar with is, like, gender dysphoria. Maybe experiences of gender dysphoria are what prompt me to say, I'm not a man, I'm a woman. But it could also include experiences of gender euphoria. It could include political commitments that I hold, such that I think it's, for whatever reasons, politically important for me to identify as a woman, even if I don't experience any gender dysphoria, any gender euphoria, or whatever. So I think, so the first part of my answer is that gender identity is whatever it is that motivates you to answer the question, what is your gender,
mm-hmm.
in the way that you do. And then the further part of my answer is that I think gender identity is, in a sense, nothing special or distinctive. It's just a feature of humans in general.
Mm-hmm.
So, and in particular, is a feature of the ways in which we make sense of ourselves and the world such that we can navigate it. So the start of the answer here is to highlight, like, I say this is probably familiar to, like, if you're taking Evan's course, and anyone who's taken a course with Evan or done that kind of work. So what's the difference between a rock and a microbe? The main difference is that, or one of the ways to think about the main difference is that rocks don't respond to their environments. Rocks are merely acted upon by external physical forces, but they don't have any endogenous reality to themselves. There's nothing a rock does or wants, except insofar as it's acted upon by external powers. Whereas a bacterium has its own kind of endogenous reality. Like, it's not just acted upon by external forces, it will also navigate its environment because of its own aims and interests. You know, it will steer itself towards food. It will try and evade predators, very basically. And we can scale this up all the way to humans, you know, in a sense, like what's distinctive of any organism, any living creature, is that it has this kind of endogenous reality, by which I mean it doesn't just react to its environment, it responds to it. It has its own goals that it's trying to get to, and it will make sense of its environment in such a way as to enable it to get to
that makes so much sense to me. I think it's really fascinating how like currently the like what we see on the news and like how people tend to think about gender is very like binary, and like it's funny because you can't disassociate from yourself like these feelings that you just experience in your life, and also the fact that these feelings in turn shape how you like. Okay, this is kind of hard to describe exactly, but I think when you sort of assume a gender identity, like male or female, like the binary ones, you're doing that because you're sort of pursuing a goal, and that's not like that's not the intrinsic experience exactly manifesting itself in terms of a gender. That's like that's as you said, like a political sort of enterprise, right?
I think that's right. Yeah, exactly. And so like, you know, so you know, what are my goals? Well, one of my goals is to like, you know, have good relationships with people or something like that, or I don't know. And then I live in I have a body that's like, you know, typically read as like a male body, and so like, you know, given that there are certain norms that I'm subjected to that I'm like, you know, broadly supposed to follow. But then, depending on the experiences I have, you know, if I, as I happen to do so, have experiences where like conforming to masculine norms makes me feel, let's just say, icky. Well, now I'm in a situation where like, what do I do? How do I navigate this situation? Like, there's on the one hand, the world is sort of like affording this kind of opportunity to me. This could, like, let's say this is like masculine opportunity to me. And then I have these experiences of like, that opportunity doesn't feel great to me. Well, I can either continue to re-engage with what the world is giving me, or I can try and find some other way around things. And I think generally what it is to be trans is that. It's sort of like,
so it's like the actual manifestation of the intrinsic feelings that you feel, and then sort of bringing that out to represent a gender then.
Yeah, kind of. Well, more seeing a relational process between the feelings and the gender norms. Like, I have the feelings that I have, and then there are the gender norms that there are. And then there are some gender norms that, just because of the body that I have, the world tends to put on me. And because of the feelings that I happen to have, those norms it doesn't work so well. If I had different feelings, then maybe those norms would work more. And that, you know, essence, that's in a sense what it is to be a cis guy. But for me, the norms don't work so well, and so I navigate myself towards different norms.
When you would navigate yourself to sort of identify yourself with other norms, is that ever like a? Are you still conforming? Is the question, I think. Is it ever the case that you can ascribe yourself a title that would make sense to everyone else, or are you always sort of conforming your sort of internal feelings to a sort of title that would make sense to other people to be able to like identify you as someone?
Yeah, so I have some thoughts about this just from like my own personal experience. So, and I think like the way for me to answer this question would be to more speak to my experience than try and give a general answer, because I think people's answers are going to vary quite a lot.
Yeah.
But I think there might be something interesting and informative about the experience I want to report. So, I mean, I already sort of like kind of loosely described my own identity earlier in our chat as like, I don't know, like non-binary or trans femme. And, I think a lot about what am I? How, like, if I have to describe my gender, how do I describe it? And like, those are roughly the terms that I've landed on. So like non-binary, trans femme, I don't know, like sometimes I describe myself as straightforwardly a trans woman.
I guess you can like more accurately describe yourself by saying not this, not that, but...
Well, even then, I don't know. What's noticeable to me is that the impetus to describe myself as something has only come as a product of social relations. It's only when other people are like, what are you? Yeah. But I'm like, oh fuck, what am I? I don't know. Like from my lived experience, I'm just Jas, and I'm Jas who, I take hormones and stuff, and like I dress in the way that I dress, but I'm not doing it because I have a strong inner conception of myself as like a woman or something, or even as like not a man. It's just, this stuff makes me feel good. Like, I didn't feel good before I started doing this, and having started doing this, I feel good. And that's really it. And then within that space, well, I live in a gendered world, and so I have, insofar as I want to articulate myself to other people and to myself, I have to articulate that within a kind of like gendered vocabulary. And I mean, like, given what gender terms mean, I can make some rough approximations. But it's really noticeable to me that for my own self, the articulation of my identity is a kind of like, it's an externalized requirement. Like, articulating an identity that is intelligible to the world I currently live in doesn't feel like I'm perfectly representing me. It's just like,
well, I guess that would apply to me, like everyone, basically.
I think so.
I actually think so as well now. You've changed my opinion, I think, successfully. But I guess if you don't sense a discrepancy as strongly as some other people could, then I guess there would be no reason for you to, like, no immediate reason at least, to like sort of expound upon this activity of trying to find.
Exactly, yeah. So like basically, like, I think that's what it is to be cis. And in a sense, like, that's where we talk about things like cis privilege and whatnot. So one of the things that I'm really interested in, big motivating part of my research is like, I don't think there's anything special about trans people. I don't think there's anything distinctive about transgender identities. I don't think there's anything metaphysically notable about trans identities as opposed to cis identities. What differences there are all political differences, are all social differences, in the sense that, like, well, given the world and the concepts that we have and the sort of resources that we have for making sense of ourselves, if you're cis, you get less pushback on the sort of identity that you want to realize and the life that you want to live than if you're trans. But I actually think that we're all doing the same thing. Like, we all have a gender identity that really is just like, well, we live in a world of gender norms, and we have to
might as well pick one.
Like, we'll just do this as part of the creatures that we are. Like, we'll just make sense of ourselves using the resources that we've got. That's all it is to have a gender identity, I think. And then I also think that, I mean, it's like what you just agreed with, but like, there's no more substance behind a trans identity than a cis identity, or vice versa. And what I would hope that my research can bring, like I think my research brings a lot to trans people, but I also think it brings stuff to cis people. And I think, like, you know, one of the things I would hope it brings is a sort of like you can interrogate your own identity because you are, like, you're the creator of it.
Yeah.
In a sense, like it's all you, and your identity, in a sense, can only mean what you want it to mean.
So that actually ties into the second question perfectly. It's can self-identity ever be a form of social resistance? Yeah. And so that I think that kind of answers that for you then. And also,
well, there's some more I can say there. Because this is the question that I'm most interested in at the moment. And so I come up with this question, you know, the main motivator for this question is like the specific question, do trans women have male privilege? And I'm interested in this question as a trans woman, but also because I really hate the way feminists have predominantly tried to answer this question so far. Generally what I see is people being like, no, trans women don't have male privilege, let's move on. And yeah, it's great, but like it just, that doesn't speak to my experience as a trans person. It doesn't help me make sense of my life as a trans person. And there are some very, very, very obvious differences that I can see between how I, let's say, embody norms of femininity versus how, like, my cis women friends do so. Like, one of them, you know, very, very obvious point of difference between the way I move through the world and the way, like, many cis women move through the world, which is, like, I am significantly more comfortable, like, taking up physical space than, like, a lot of cis women are. That's because I was, like, socialized as a guy for about 30 years. And, that, you know, that my history of living as a guy makes a difference to how I exist as a woman or whatever I exist as now. And so simply saying that I don't have male privilege seems too quick. But I also do want to say that trans women don't have male privilege. And I'm very interested in figuring out how identifying as trans is politically resistant. And I don't have a amazingly worked out answer yet, but the answer I give is roughly this. So imagine the difference between, well, like, you know, like, let's imagine ourselves and, you know, like, we'll, like, wind back the clock on me about 10 years to when I was just, like, starting to think about my gender identity. But, you know, I'm being perceived as a guy, you know, like, so let's say, like, we're both in a position where, like, we're both being perceived as men, treated as men, and, like, expected to act in that way. There's still, so historically feminists have kind of said, like, there's no difference between these two cases. Like, the trans woman who is positioned, who is treated as a guy, and the cis man who's treated as a guy, both occupy the same set of social relations. They're in the same social conditions of being perceived as a guy. And I think that identifying as trans in that situation is politically resistant in the following way. So one of the things that transphobia does is it sort of tries to, there are various ways to describe it, but one way to describe it is to say that it tries to eliminate the possibility of trans people. In the sense of, like, so let's say I'm, like, you know, there doing the guy thing, being perceived as a guy and all that stuff, but, like, you know, I've got these feelings where, like, stuff just isn't lining up properly. And one way I could resolve those feelings is to sort of realize, oh, what I want to do is I want to live as a woman. What transphobia does, or one of the things that transphobia does, is it puts all sorts of barriers in the way to me having that interpretation, to me seeing that, like, oh, I want to live as a woman. And instead it will make me think, like, I'm a pervert, or I'm a freak, or I'm a whatever derogatory term it might be. And insofar as I believe those transphobic stereotypes, I will not transition.
Yeah. Or even if not even believe, but just hear, or like...
That's right.
Acknowledge the existence of these claims that are raised from...
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so by identifying as trans, I resist that stuff. And there's a first point where it's, in a sense, it's like just a subjective act of resistance. And I'm saying that while subjective, it's nonetheless politically substantive and real. And then, there are further like acts of resistance that we can do, in like more externally, socially, political contexts. But I think that initial subjective act of being like, no, I'm not a fucking pervert, I'm trans, is resistance.
Yeah, it has like political ramifications, I guess.
Yeah.
Maybe if it isn't like, like the goal could be even, inconsequential sort of, or like the goal wouldn't necessarily have to be like, okay, this is wrong or this is right. It's like a self-expression, which coincidentally turns out to be sort of against what the positivist regime is offering.
Exactly. Like if we didn't live under patriarchy, there would be nothing notable about this interpretation. It's only the fact that we live under patriarchy that makes it significant. But patriarchy is real, and so it is a significant act given that context, I think.
How would you define patriarchy?
Yeah.
Jordan Peterson's like manifesting inside of me right now.
Very roughly, I think patriarchy is a system that works broadly towards the social advantages of people who are presumed to be male and towards the social disadvantages of people presumed to be female. I think that's what patriarchy is. And I think that's the most concise definition of patriarchy you could give. I think any more definitions of patriarchy start to become a little bit too loaded in a way that is arguably objectionable. I mean, there's probably one modification I should make to that definition. Patriarchy is the system that advantages people presumed to be male at the expense of disadvantaging people presumed to be female. What that modification sort of like enables you to better make sense of is the fact that like men are harmed by patriarchy and disadvantaged by patriarchy all the time. I mean, in fact, like one of the nice things about having taught this course is like I've had a couple of office hours where like some guys taking the course have kind of like come in and said like, hey, this course has like helped me critique some assumptions about masculinity that I've been making, and like now my life is going better.
Yeah.
Like, that's wonderful. So men get fucked over by patriarchy all the time. However, women get fucked over by patriarchy, and the ways in which women get fucked over by patriarchy is it subjugates them to men. So even though men get fucked over by patriarchy, they're still put in a position of advantage over women.
Yeah.
And I think that's what patriarchy does. It's the system that puts people presumed male into a position of advantage over people presumed female.
Yeah.
Even if everyone in that equation is getting screwed over.
Do you think that's like deliberate, or do you think that's like an effect of the metaphysics that you hold? If you're a religious zealot or something, like, do you think you're patriarchal from the perspective of other people, or are you like actually, do you have an agenda to be in a patriarchy?
Yeah, I think it's a bit of both. I guess. So like standard wisdom for feminist analysis is that these sorts of social phenomena are explained by what we call the structures. They're not explained by the individuals. So that's to say that no individual person is necessarily intending for there to be a patriarchy in order for patriarchy to exist.
Yeah.
And this is kind of like what I guess, I think I mentioned this in like a previous recording, but we didn't record.
Yeah.
But of like, this sort of like a tangent, but a tangent that I want to make is like, this is why I think when I see people and feminists, particularly online, but also in real life, making claims sort of to the effect that like, you know, well, the reason why people like Andrew Tate or Jordan Peterson are popular is because young boys want to retain their power under patriarchy is just absolutely fucking ludicrous, because that's just not the case at all. Like, young boys don't have a notion of patriarchy. They don't have a notion that they are beneficiaries of a system. Mostly they're insecure and terrified that they'll never get laid and that they have like the wrong sized body parts or something. It's just that we live in a system, patriarchy, that is such that the ways in which things work out, they'll get advantaged.
Yeah.
But it's not like, they're not like, I want these advantages.
Exactly. It's just like you can't refute the occurrence. Like, it's there.
Exactly.
Like, it doesn't really matter how you identify, like what term you use, or like whether it's incidental or not.
Exactly. And so to that point, I think patriarchy is very unintentional. More recently, I guess in like the last couple of years, I've started to come around to the idea that it's not entirely unintentional. And that there are plausibly specific individuals that one could point to as, for want of a better phrase, intentionally reproducing patriarchy. I mean, like, Donald Trump might be such a figure. You know, people who have like such outsized cultural influence and also seem to like be intentionally acting towards a certain kind of, in this case, masculinity that would accrue them certain advantages. Maybe, I mean, I don't know, I immediately want to back off from this because like Donald Trump is a fucking idiot. So I don't want to attribute too much like Machiavellian planning to him. But I think insofar as patriarchy is perpetuated by social material conditions, well, it does seem like some people in power make more intentional choices to perpetuate those conditions than other people do. Yeah. So.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I think that answers that question. Okay. So we have the Ontology of Privilege here, which I was really interested in, because even in class I think we talked about this like briefly about like what if privilege doesn't exist at all? Like what do you mean by privilege? Can you sort of go into that a bit?
For sure, yeah. So I think privilege is a really important concept. It's a really important tool in sort of like the feminist or like socially critical toolbox. And it's a concept that's been like horribly mangled in like the public sphere. And I actually think like it, I mean, maybe I've just drunk the Kool-Aid for too long, but I think that like once you kind of like strip away the concept of privilege of some of its more like pernicious and misinterpreted aspects, it's a pretty straightforward and pretty uncontroversial concept. So the concept of privilege is I would describe it as like it's a concept of material conditions, in the sense that like privilege isn't a psychological concept. It's not an identity concept either. Privilege isn't something that it's even quite correct to say that an individual person has. Individuals are recipients of privileges, but they're not, privileges aren't really things that any individual possesses. So, a material understanding of privilege is just to say that there are certain material conditions that affect different groups of people differently. That's really like the ground floor idea about privilege, that the material conditions of our society have different effects for different groups of people. So, like, you know, what are some examples of that going to be? Well, some examples are going to be, let's say, if you grow up in a society where there isn't really any provision made for, like, affordable childcare. Well, that's a material condition that's going to affect people who want to have children. If you also live in a society where, let's say, men are typically paid more than women, then we can already, like, those two conditions, I mean, like, the pay gap is already a notion of privilege, but, like, the pay gap has enough controversy attached to it that, like, expand the example a little bit. So let's say we've got a society where, like, there's no real affordable childcare and there's a gender pay gap. So, you know, people who want to have kids, probably one of them is going to have to quit work to, like, look after the kids. Well, if you've got a gender pay gap, then, like, such that the man is going to be likely to earning more money, it makes sense for the woman to quit work.
Yeah.
This is just a very basic example of how the material conditions of our society are going to, like, have different effects on people.
I can sort of see why, like, from an experiential perspective, you would obviously, like, of course there's privilege. Like, what do you mean? Like, I'm a guy, I'm white, I can, you know, do certain things that other people can't because of my pre-existing circumstances in life. But then again, like, when you think about privilege in terms of like a religious perspective, then it almost seems to disappear for me, for my intuition, because as far as I can tell, there's like a certain mode that you should be living, or like there's a certain code of life, essentially, in religion. And then if you would follow through with that, then your privilege seems to disappear completely, because you're like, even if you have 2 limbs or if you have 4 limbs, no matter the case, you're supposed to be doing this. Privilege from a strictly like religious Christian American like U.S. perspective, because like the U.S. Constitution is under God or something, like that's like the idea. Then what is privilege? Because there's like one thing that everyone should be doing, and then
good, yeah. So in that case, then I think the way to think about privilege would be, so, you know, there's one thing roughly that we're all meant to be doing, but we're not all equal in our ability to be able to do that. And that's not necessarily, you know, features of our, like, ability or mental capacities or anything, but, like, I don't know, like, let's say I'm supposed to eat kosher. And I live in a food desert. You know, I live in one of these places where, like, there's no good access to food, like, there's only one crappy grocery store. And the grocery store doesn't sell kosher foods. And I work 3 jobs, so I don't have the time to prepare myself kosher foods. Well, that's an example of privilege, or in this case, a lack thereof. You know, people who have to eat kosher and who don't live in food deserts just have a easier time doing that thing than I would have if I lived in a food desert. So privilege is the thing that lets you, or that makes a difference to your ability to do the things that you either are supposed to do or want to do.
Maybe if you would like construe what you're supposed to be doing from a perspective of like an effort, for example, maybe then I guess you could dispense with privilege, even though that's like...
Well, I think privilege is going to always enter into the picture, because privilege in this regard is an ontological reality. It's better I should say, it's a reality of our social conditions and our material conditions. It's not really a reality of our concepts or our cognition. It's not the most perfect way of putting it, but it will do for now. Like, it doesn't matter how I, let's say, internalize the expectations that I'm under. It doesn't matter what my beliefs about them might be. If I don't have access to kosher food, then I can't eat kosher.
Mm-hmm.
If I don't have access to a good school system, then like it's going to be really hard for me to get into university.
Yeah.
If I don't have access to good job opportunities, it's going to be hard for me to like get by.
Mm.
And those points of access have nothing to do with with whatever beliefs I have about myself or the world. They're just hard facts of my reality.
Yeah.
Like, there just isn't any affordable childcare.
Mm-hmm.
Or like, there just aren't any supermarkets selling kosher foods. Or like, there's just no one who will give me a job.
Mm.
That I think is what privilege is.
Okay.
And there it doesn't really matter how we subjectively relate to it, because those limits are going to be there no matter what.
I guess then the limits that there will be in any case would sort of depend on the goal that you select, right?
Yeah.
So if you want to keep kosher and then there's no kosher grocery store around you, then of course you're going to fail, and then people living around a kosher grocery store are going to have privilege compared to you.
Mm-hmm,
but then that's also, all of that is in relationship with the goal of having a kosher diet.
Good, yeah.
And what if that's not the goal? What if the goal is to be as a good of a human being as possible, to aspire for the kingdom of God, or whatever, however the Bible puts it. And so if your efforts at attaining goodness as like the ultimate goal, then I guess privilege would disappear, because the efforts seems to be what matters.
Again, I think it's gonna, I think it's going to depend on the particulars there, and I think it's going to depend on, I guess, in this sense, like, what is it to be a good person? What is it to strive for the kingdom of God? So, like, let's say that, being a good person includes charitable acts towards other people. Well, I might not have the resources to engage in charity. Or I might not have the time to engage in charity. I might not have the opportunity to engage in helping other people. Maybe I live in some, god-awful, sprawling American suburb where, like, I don't really see other people in my day-to-day life. I just... Subsist, yeah. And I mean, that also, I think, is another thing that sort of like, how to phrase this? Striving to be a good person is also going to presume that I am psychologically fit to do so.
Yeah.
And it might be that my social conditions
haven't allowed for that. Yeah. Oh, I see. Yeah, then there would be no way of disentangling privilege from your worldly outcomes.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay, I think I see the point in that. Okay, that's great. The other question would be... Oh, okay, this is really interesting. From Evan's course, we've really touched upon this. The relationship between intelligibility and reality.
Yeah.
And is there like a separation possible there?
Yeah. It's a really good question.
Yeah.
Because I want to say yes. Like, it seems like the obvious answer there is yes. Because presumably, like, I don't believe that the world depends on my mind to exist. So, like, if all humans went extinct, like, the universe is going to carry on.
Yeah. Would a tree fall if no one was there in the forest?
Exactly. Yeah. Like, trees are going to keep falling, like, stars are going to keep getting created, like, all the little creatures are going to keep being little creatures, like, that's fine. However, actually trying to articulate that seems to me like it starts to become a bit of an impossible task.
Yeah.
And I don't know quite what to do with that. Because there are some things whereby, some like sort of like challenges or paradoxes or semi-paradoxes, paradox-looking things, seem like they're just features of our language and like just ways of talking about things. I think like a lot of Russell's stuff about like the set that contains all and only sets that contain themselves or something. It is like a feature of our language primarily. But the point about intelligibility and ontology, I don't know. I don't know what it would actually mean to talk about raw or bare unexperienced reality.
Yeah.
It seems to me obvious that if all the humans disappeared, like the stars are still going to shine. Okay, cool. But what actually does that mean?
Yeah.
What does it mean to say that a star is going to continue to shine?
Yeah, because even the word shine is like something that you create, to be able to...
Exactly. Well, and also I think so there are a few directions from which we can attack this. So one is this point that these concepts are sort of like our impositions on things. Also, the ways in which we individuate things are very circumstantial. I look at the table and I see a table, I see some chairs, I see them as distinct objects. And I can also see, I can actually see that the table's got some planks and there's the legs of the table. So I can decompose the object in my mind. I can also recompose the object in my mind. I could actually see that it's the dining room object, the table and chairs. Once there starts to be a little bit of looseness or vagueness in the boundaries between objects, then I think that I at least can see my way into a serious problem for the idea of objects will persist even if I'm unable to conceptualize them. In the sense that it's hard for me to not feel crazy saying this, but is the star a distinct object? Is the star distinct from the nebula? Is the nebula distinct from the galaxy? How distinct are these objects actually?
So it all matters on the interpretation.
Kind of. This is where there's gonna be something. There's gotta be something that, even if our interpretations went away, would still be going.
Yeah, metaphysically existent.
Exactly.
Whatever that amounts to. But there would be no way to articulate any specific part of it and call it a chair. There's just this blob of existence that you just attribute specific titles to the parts of the blob.
Exactly, yeah. That at least is my take on it, and there are lots of different takes that one could have.
We went over this one view last day. It was about this. It's I think Nagarjuna. Have you heard of it?
Yeah, Nagarjuna.
And the emptiness.
Emptiness.
That was a profound take. My mind was officially blown.
Nagarjuna is very good for that.
I had trouble separating whether it was a metaphysical argument or whether it was an epistemological argument, and that's why I think this question sort of came into my mind.
My understanding is that people continue to debate whether Nagarjuna is making an epistemic point or a metaphysical point, or even something that is not epistemic or metaphysical. I tend to read Nagarjuna as a metaphysical point, but I'm pretty interested in the Buddhist ontologies. I find Nagarjuna very, very, very hard to make sense of.
That's what it seemed like in the lecture as well. So, philosophy of love. I've actually never heard of this. Would you be able to provide?
Yeah, totally. It's a little bit of a sort of. I haven't done much work in philosophy of love in the last couple of years, but it's definitely a big part of my research wheelhouse. So it comes out of, so my PhD supervisor is Carrie Jenkins, and she has been doing for like the last 7 years this like big project on the philosophy of love. And the kind of central question is this metaphysical question of what is love? But I mean, really, in a sense, like, I think that what Carrie is doing, and certainly what I'm doing in philosophy of love, is so like similar to what feminist epistemologists are doing with respect to epistemology. We're kind of doing feminism of love. Like, it's a critical project about what love is. So like looking at, you know, what are the dominant assumptions that we make about love and about what love is and about what loving relationships are, and how might those assumptions be challengeable, and what sorts of broader social phenomena do those assumptions feed into. I mean, for both of us, the main motivating question, and I'm not outing Carrie here at all, she's very public about this, is we as you said, not together, but we both do polyamory. Mm-hmm. And are sort of both interested in how polyamorous love is possible, as it were, given that love is so heavily associated with monogamy. And that's a sort of like, those are the sorts of philosophical questions that I've been interested in, and that Carrie as well have been exploring. But it's fairly new. It's an attempt to bring questions of love into sort of like philosophical methodologies, and see what can be usefully analysed about them. So, you know, there are various philosophical conceptions of what love is. All of them are like highly objectionable, because they all kind of presume, they all presume monogamy. They also all presume that, like, really love is just a feeling, which seems to me to be like one of the more uninteresting aspects of love from like a point of view of investigation. Yeah. So, I mean, one of the questions that I'm really interested in is like, kind of comes out of Bell Hooks's work. So Bell Hooks is a really interesting thinker, I should say. I was about to describe her as a philosopher, but that's not quite right. She's a thinker and a theorist. She's a well-known black scholar, and she has thought a lot about love, and she's thought a lot about love in like political contexts and in like racialized contexts, and she thinks a lot about gender as well. She has a very famous line, I guess, where she says that love is incompatible with abuse, which actually bumps really hard against a lot of the ways in which we talk about love, and particularly like talk about love in abusive relationships. You know, there's a sort of like, I don't know quite how socially prevalent it is now, but I mean, certainly 10 years ago, and a long time before that, there was an idea that abusive partners often did love you, and that you could love someone and abuse them. Like, you could be an abusive partner, and while you were abusive, you know, so like it contended with the abusiveness, but still sort of tried to say like, but there's love there. And Hooks's point is to basically say like, no, love is incompatible with abuse. But if you love someone, or if you are abusing someone, then you cannot be loving them.
I see. And
the main upshot of this is to shift the notion of love not as a feeling, but as an activity. Love is something that we do. Love is something that we do with each other, to each other, and with ourselves and to ourselves. And so then, again, it becomes, you know, part of the stuff that me and Carrie are interested in is thinking about how do our social relationships and social assumptions make a difference to the ways in which we're able to love ourselves and the ways in which we're able to love other people as a verb, as something that we do to each other people.
I see. Would that, okay, so recently I've thought of this a lot because I'm reading the Bible nowadays, and it's just like a very interesting idea. I thought a lot about like romantic love versus like brotherly love, I'll put it here, and how in one sense I can sort of see why romantic love is sort of displayed as like a vain thing almost, because it's like it's like more, it's more alive in a sense, like it's like a fiery sort of thing. And then also this brotherly love then is like a more of like a compassion, or like like sort of, I don't even know how to put it exactly, but it seems to me like it's because this thing is so sort of efficacious in a sense, the romantic love is so like efficacious in a sense, it's like it's because it's so powerful and like so captivating for an individual person, or it tends to be rather, it's like more vain, because when you lose it, it's like more damaging to you, and so I was thinking like, should one aspire to like love everyone or everything with brotherly love instead, because it's not as vain,
right?
Or like, would you really comment on that at all?
Yeah, for sure. So I think so I guess my first thought is that I would be very skeptical about any project that's going to be trying to get humans to not engage in romantic love. Like, you know, I think there are just obviously there are some, you know, some people are aromantic, and that's fine, but most people are not, and engaging in romantic love seems to be it's part of the tapestry of human experience. Like it's just something that many of us do. And indeed, you know, there are all sorts of social problems associated with trying to like prevent people from engaging in romantic love in various sorts of forms. I guess I also think that the tendency to associate romantic love with this kind of like, you know, it's very hot, it's very fiery, it like seems very like socially significant. Well, I think that's like, I want to say that's partly a product of our social arrangements. You know, it's the fact that like we as a society, you know, we value and reward romantic and sexual relationships more than we reward other sorts of relationships. So like this is something that I'm kind of like, you know, bumping up into in my everyday life as I age. So I'm like 35 years old, which means that a lot of my friends are starting to get married and have babies. And that means that I see them a lot less. And this kind of pisses me off, because I'm like,
where's my body?
I'm your friend. Yeah. Like, I've been your friend for like 25 years, and like you've known this woman for like 5 years, and now you're like spending all your time with her, and like I'm supposed to just kind of like accept that, and like, well, of course you're neglecting our friendship because you're married, and like, of course your marriage would be the thing that you spend all your time on. And I kind of want to be like, fuck that. Like, I am also a person, and our friendship is like a valuable part of both of our lives. You know, we've both invested a lot into it over the course of our lives, and now this presumption that I'm just supposed to like let it go because they got married is like, I think it's nonsense.
So like this, like even the notion that I had about romantic love, and it's like it's sort of fiery nature or whatever, like it's you're saying basically that's sort of stemming from like an intrinsic, not even intrinsic, like a social construct of viewing it as such. And that's like a reason why it's like so.
I think so, yeah. I mean, I like if I think back, like I've had some like really fiery, passionate friendships where there was no sexual element at all. You know, like it's not like I've had passionate friendships where I was happening to like have sex with my friends or something. It's that just for ways in which we engage, we're like passionate, exciting, and like, you know, vivacious in all of those ways. So I think that our concepts about romantic and non-romantic relationships lead us to not quite see those relationships in their full features. But it's not to say that all my friendships have been fiery and passionate. But equally, like, I've had, like, quote-unquote romantic and sexual relationships that have been pretty mundane. That have not been as significant as my friendships, let's say. So I think, like, when we actually attend to our experiences of romantic and non-romantic and sexual relationships, they don't really square up to the, like, concepts of love and friendship that we're given. And I think we have to distort ourselves to fit ourselves into those boxes a little bit more.
Okay, so I guess then, like, it's sort of because you, for example, with the gender identity as binary example, if I identify myself as strictly male and, like, in the binary form, then I would represent my friendships and interactions with other people in ways that would conform to a man's friendship or, like, a man's wife, girlfriend, partner.
Exactly.
Okay, so I see. It all plays into. It's like the loop that I was talking about. It's like once you once you view life in a certain way, then the truism that you select becomes the truism that you're sort of observing life with.
That's right.
Like creating even, generating things.
Yeah, like we have a remarkable ability to loop these sorts of processes and, like, have, engage in these recursive processes without quite realizing that we're doing a recursive thing.
That's really interesting. Okay, so what's the next question here? Oh, okay. Is there anything specific about philosophy or the philosophical methodologies that make it difficult for marginalized people to engage in philosophy?
This is a great question. And this is something that I've been thinking about for, like, the last few years as well. And so I should say as well that so at the start of the COVID lockdowns, I was and really since then up to now, I've been working on a research project with a few other philosophers. Actually, Alison Wiley is the lead of a project. We read her in our course. That's engaging this question. And in particular, what we're doing is there's, like, a lot of literature on this question that's very dispersed and scattered all over the place, and we've been creating a database to collect it all in one place. So this is something that I think about quite a lot. So I guess, like, I've been thinking about how I want to get into this question and how I want to answer it, because there's a lot to say, and I don't want to overload an answer. And so I think, like, one good way of me giving an answer is to give my own answer and my own experiences with this. I have a little bit of a funny perspective, or have had a funny experience as a philosopher, because, like, so this is to bring back in the notion of transition as well. So, like, I didn't transition until I was, depending on how you want to count it, like 28 years old. So I lived, like, a long time as, like, a guy, and, like, didn't really question that, and was doing philosophy as a guy for, like, a long time. And certainly during my undergraduate, I started to shed this a little bit during my master's, but, like, I was a philosophy bro. Like, I was, like, all about, like, canonical core philosophy, and I was all about that kind of, like, philosophical debate, that, like, quote-unquote objective kind of stance. And, I thought that, like, things like emotions and whatnot were, just, like, impediments to reason. And now I'm a trans person doing very trans philosophy and trying to figure out my place in the profession in that regard. And I look at the profession and I look at the sorts of questions that non-trans philosophers want to ask about trans identities. And I equal parts want to tear my own hair out and tear their hair out. because so much of a philosophical discussion is still mired in this question of, are trans identities legitimate? Or like, are trans people really the genders they say they are? And, or like, even more so, like, do trans people deserve respect? And it's very hard as a trans person to engage with these questions in what is supposed to be the paradigmatic philosophical method of sort of being like, who knows? Maybe trans identities aren't legitimate. Let me, I will accept that as a possible position in logical space, and let's see how our arguments are going to work to engage those various positions. I'm like, no, fuck off. Like, my life is not a matter of debate. How I want to live my life really is not a matter of debate. And so there's a very straightforward sense in which a philosophical, like being a trans philosopher, and especially being a trans philosopher who wants to do trans stuff, is very challenging because I'm expected to engage with a question that I think is fucking bullshit. Then there's like further points of frustration, which is that I actually think there are really, really interesting questions to ask about trans identities that aren't settled. They're like open philosophical questions about trans identity. I mean, like, the question of trans women and male privilege, I think, is one such question. Like, while I understand why we want to give a quick and simple, like, no, trans women don't have male privilege, let's fucking move on. And I get why we would do that in certain social contexts. That question is actually really philosophically interesting. I mean, another question is like, was I ever a guy? That's a really interesting question to me. And like, that question matters to me from my own point of view, in like trying to make sense of my life. And it's not really a question that I get to ask in a philosophical context. So there are those sorts of problems. Further problems sort of exist at an even higher and more abstracted structural level. And this is something that I'm starting to bump into more and more just at the sort of like professional level that I'm at. So I'm currently both trying to get jobs and I'm also trying to like publish work in academic journals, and I'm trying to like publish my dissertation as a book. The problem is my work is all about trans stuff, and trans stuff is regarded as a kind of like marginal issue. It's like a sub-discipline of a sub-discipline. So many of the mainstream philosophy journals just won't take my work. They won't publish my work. That then counts against my I'm forgetting my words, but sort of my reputation as a philosopher. If I'm not able to publish in the most prestigious journals, then I am less attractive of a job candidate. If I'm less likely to get a job, then my work is then less likely to be further perpetuated. Exactly. So these sorts of problems all kind of compound onto each other. So there's a sort of like individual kind of like issue of philosophical culture. There's, like what counts as good philosophy, and like trans philosophy generally doesn't count as that. And then there's like university level incentives. Right. And at the same time, in those incentives as well, work on trans issues just doesn't have as much weight as work on other issues.
But the reason, it seems to me the reason behind that is the exact sort of appropriation of yourself to like fit in these identities, or like the gender identities that are binary. And so if that was not the case, then obviously trans issues in philosophy would be more prevalent, because the sort of lens that you're operating from like dismisses these issues because they're not relevant to where you're situated. But it doesn't mean that like that still doesn't apply to you because you're not using the same vocabulary as the person trying to describe what's happening there.
Exactly, yeah. So it's so similar like what we've been talking about like the last couple of weeks in class over like the politics of representation. Is like I have to articulate my claims within the current system.
Yeah.
And the current system is such that it kind of disregards claims like mine. So yeah, there's this. It's a tricky situation. And such as it is for trans people, so it is for black people, indigenous people. I mean, women. Like, all these like any set of issues that are specific to a group of people tend to get disregarded in philosophy.
Yeah. So yes, there is something specific about a philosophy that makes it difficult for marginalized people to engage.
Yeah.
So okay. We have why do philosophy next.
Yeah, that is a good question. I think there are two levels of answer I want to give here, or I suppose three. There's like why do philosophy like why be philosophical generally. Why take a philosophy degree? And then why do graduate work in philosophy? I think they have slightly different answers. Why do philosophy in general? It makes us better people. Like it just does. Like it's.
I guess that depends on what you mean by better people.
Yeah. So I mean, and yeah, good. So I don't mean more ethical. I don't mean more moral. But I do mean more able to, communicate with others, to ascertain what's going on with themselves, and to ascertain what's going on with other people.
Yeah.
Like, I think as an activity, philosophy is primarily a communicative and interpretive activity. It's about interpreting ourselves and it's about interpreting other people. And that's just really important for day-to-day life. It's really important to like know who you are and what you need and what you want, and it's really important to be able to figure those things out in other people.
Yeah.
And I think if you do philosophy, it gives you that. It also gives you the critical skills, but in a sense, like I think those critical skills are a part of the communication. Like being able to figure out like what am I feeling in this moment? What am I actually thinking in this moment? Like, beyond just like the immediate reactive thought, like what do I think about this and why?
Right.
I think philosophy gives you the kinds of tools that you need to answer those questions. As for doing a degree in philosophy, like why take an undergraduate degree in philosophy? Philosophy graduates are some of the most employable university graduates. So there's all this kind of like nonsense idea of like you study philosophy and like cool, good luck flipping burgers after university. And that's actually bullshit. Like all the data that we have about employability and sort of like placement in jobs following undergraduate degrees suggests that philosophers are some of the most employable non-specialist graduates. So, obviously like if you're a lawyer, you do a law degree or whatever, a medical degree, then it's fairly direct route into employment there. But, across non-STEM subjects, philosophers are the most employable. And that's because the skill set that we teach you is thinking critically. And it turns out that, like, lots of contexts require critical thinking, and most people are really, really bad at critical thinking. This is something that as philosophy instructors, we sort of have to... When I grade essays for like a first year course, and like especially when I grade the first round of essays, like, first assignment in like intro to philosophy, I am not expecting good work. Like I am expecting a whole bunch of like, if I'm to speak uncharitably, like asinine approaches to these questions. But of course, because by and large, we are not taught to think critically. And critical thinking is actually really hard, as students who take philosophy classes soon realize. Like, the things that we're asking you to do in these classes are challenging. Like, it is not an easy, it's not easy credit to take a philosophy course. because what we're getting you to do is think critically. And people tend to not be taught how to think critically, and critical thinking is very hard. Once you get it, once you start doing it, genuinely that is a kind of superpower. And it's certainly one that makes you very employable. So there are just some good practical reasons to take philosophy degree. You know, if you're going into university and you don't have a clear sense of what you want to do, philosophy can be a really good option. Because, I mean, it's just like, it's a cool subject and philosophers are cool people. So like, you'll probably meet some interesting folks on the philosophy degree. But also it's actually going to give you a set of tools that are going to be both incredibly valuable in like an employment market, but also just going to be valuable to your life. Graduate work in philosophy is a little bit different. And I guess like I want to say something here just because in my time like teaching and TAing at UBC, I've had like lots of conversations with undergraduates who are like, I want to do a PhD in philosophy, or, you know, I want to do graduate work in philosophy. And I always want to, I want to encourage that, but also give a sense of the reality that entails. So when I was thinking about going into PhD school, you know, I was reasonably good at philosophy as an undergraduate and during my master's. So like, my tutors were kind of saying like, you should probably do you should think about doing a PhD. And I was speaking to one of my tutors about it, and she gave me just what has been the best piece of advice, and really the only worthwhile piece of advice I got, which was, do a PhD in philosophy if, when at the end of the PhD you don't get a job, you won't regret having done the PhD. And that was a very, very, very good piece of advice. Because basically what it helped me think about is that like, I should do a PhD if there is a question or a set of questions that I'm interested in asking and answering. I shouldn't do it if I want to get a job. If, you know, I am trying to get a job in universities.
But that's not the end goal.
It's not, it can't be the end goal.
Yeah.
Because if it's the end goal, then you will almost certainly fail. Just because the academic job market is horrendous.
Yeah, favors one subject over the other. Like.
Well, not even that. So like the positions that I apply to will get like 250 applicants. And then like one. Yeah. You know, it's one position. And like, you know, everyone who's applying has a PhD, has some publications, like, you know, I am competing with incredibly smart, successful people. And so I may be very smart and successful. Doesn't really matter when it comes to the job market. Like there's just no guarantees at all. Even if I wanted to just like, if I wasn't worried about tenure in research and I just wanted to have some like shitty teaching job somewhere, even that's hard to get. So doing graduate work in philosophy is a bad idea if you want to get a job. If you also care a lot about like your material financial circumstances, it's not necessarily great, or at the very least there are real costs there. So I'm in my mid-30s and I have no money. I don't own any property, I don't really have any savings. My other friends in their mid-30s who like didn't do PhDs, you know, they're like buying houses, they have like savings, they're like, you know, making retirement plans and that kind of thing. That's just not the position I'm in. But I'm really glad I did the PhD. And if in a year's time after this I'm like working in some fast food restaurant, I mean, that will piss me off, but like, I'm not going to regret. It would have been worth it. Yeah, I'm not ever going to regret doing this.
I think I like sense some sort of like a hero myth there. It's as if like it's through exerting yourself in the pursuit of something worthwhile that you truly believe to be worthwhile, that you do it in the first place.
Absolutely.
Like it's not any other reason. It's not because I want money that I'm trying to pursue law or like whatever. I'm trying to do that because that's like a good thing that I could bring to this world.
Exactly, yeah. And every PhD student that I know who has lasted in the program, who has not dropped out, that's the attitude we all have.
Yeah.
Like that seems to be the attitude that you need to have to get through a PhD program. Because like my life as a PhD student is really sweet. Like it's great. Like I have a really nice life, but it is very hard. Like doing a PhD is exceedingly challenging, and there are a lot of costs to it. You know, there are a lot of like real costs to your life.
Yeah.
That's just, you know, everything has costs and everything has benefits, and I one of the things that I worry about is that, you know, people can get a very idyllic and idealized view of what graduate school is like. Like, you get to have all these like intelligent conversations with these like interested people and the faculty and all of that. And like, that's true. I do get to do that. You know, like, I get to hang out with all the faculty and like have all these conversations. You know, I'm like part of like international research networks, and like, you know, my life is full of like interesting people and interesting conversations, but there are also these material costs. And they're real, and you know, they are a challenge that I've had to figure out how to navigate. And I just think it's important that people, like, graduate work in philosophy is really wonderful. Like, if you like philosophy and if like those kinds of pursuits are valuable to you, it's wonderful. It's just, that's the reality.
It seems as though like you have to select exactly what you want to get out of it. And you've done that, I think, to the extent that you want. To the extent that
I know why my PhD is valuable for me.
Exactly. Well, exactly. What more could anyone want, I guess. Okay, so this question was actually really surprising for me to see as, is philosophy a real subject / mode of inquiry? Okay, what does this even mean? And
it is. It definitely is. If nothing else, because of the kinds of critical analyses that the philosophers do, are just, you're not going to find this level of critique in any other university department, at least at an undergraduate level. You know, when you start to get to graduate levels, you know, maybe like other arts departments have similar levels of like critical engagement. But like STEM subjects are largely like, you are learning a set of rote facts all the way up. I mean, I know that's a little bit of a simplification. I know people who like, at all levels of STEM subjects, you know, will do like critical work as, you know, like analyze the assumptions that are being made. But it's not the prime directive of these subjects. Philosophy, the prime directive is critical analysis. Like more so than any of the content that we look at, it is honing critical analytical skills. And so to that end, I think philosophy is a real discipline. You know, whether it needs philosophy departments, I don't know. I mean, I'm glad that philosophy departments exist because I want to get a job in one of them. And they seem to be my kind of people. But I also think like philosophical content is like legitimate content. You know, like, I mean, logic, for one, is like a very good example of this. Like, you know, logic is a real subject. You know, if pure mathematics is real, then logic is real.
When I first saw this question, I actually thought of like, does this mean, is philosophy like real as in sort of, does it have a foundation? Like, is it just like senseless skepticism about anything and everything, or does it have like a point to prove? Is it like the impression that I had?
Yeah. That I think is a trickier question. I guess I go back and forth on this a little bit. I probably think that philosophy is an activity more than a subject. And so in a sense it's like, as you described it, like senseless skepticism. But I don't think it's senseless. Like I think it's philosophy is skepticism, but it's organized skepticism. I guess like a sort of like maybe a sort of like useful analogy would be like, philosophy is to skepticism what, I don't know, what political organizing is to riots or something. Like, we can all be skeptical, and we can be skeptical in like really dumb and undirected ways. You know, like, I can sit in a conversation with someone and I can spend every time I speak like, what do you mean by this? What do you mean by this? What do you mean by this? Or like, why do I like, why do you have to prove that or whatever? Like, okay, whatever.
Yeah.
Philosophy is learning how to be skeptical in a productive way. It's learning how to use those abilities to actually arrive at fruitful conclusions.
Yeah.
You know, like simply being like, what do you mean by that? What do you mean by that? What do you mean by that? That's not serving any purpose except making the conversation go nowhere.
But I guess philosophy goes nowhere too, if you think about it. Like,
I don't disagree with that.
How so? How, like?
Well,
okay, so I think philosophy goes nowhere in the sense that like there's no ultimate truth. That's what I mean. But if you sort of analyze like societies and like which obviously matter to us because we live in a society and how the society operates makes a difference in our lives. So
I mean, I guess like that I do agree with then. I think like philosophy has made progress in itself, in the sense that like some of the philosophical tools that we have developed for answering the kinds of questions that we want to ask are better than the tools that we had a couple hundred years ago or something. So one example I think of like clear philosophical progress is like Saul Kripke's work. So Kripke, I mean, he kind of sucks as a person, but like he was an interesting philosopher. I think he died just very recently, like in the last couple of years or something. He might still be alive, I'm not sure. I had a friend of mine who was like a research assistant for Kripke, and he was just like constantly trying to sexually assault me. Nonetheless, his philosophical work is interesting. And one of Kripke's big things is this thing called, if any of you have done like Phil 340, you're going to come across this.
Metaphysics.
The metaphysics course. Is Kripke's notion of necessity and contingency, and specifically the a posteriori necessity. That is, a relationship of necessity that can be discovered empirically. Now, this was like a very big deal when Kripke first put this forward, because for hundreds and really back to Plato at least, philosophers had just generally assumed that necessities can only be discovered by conceptual analysis. You can never discover a necessity by looking at the world. And Kripke said, no, we can empirically discover necessity relationships. That's a big deal. That is a genuine point of advancement in philosophical methods. You know, similarly, I think like the sorts of, if we think about like the concept of a standpoint that we were sort of like looking at, and how, you know, we looked at some of the problems with like early notions of standpoints that seem to feed into these like problems of essentialism and relativism. And then we saw like, oh, no, we can clarify this concept of a standpoint, and once we've got this concept, it can do some useful work to us. So that's the kind of progress that I think philosophy makes.
So it does change society for the better, which is
I think so.
All that matters, I guess.
At the very least, it changes society, not always for the better. I mean,
of course, yeah.
A good example of this would be like the American Constitution is substantially influenced by the philosophy of John Locke, and in particular John Locke's theories of property, natural property rights, and the role of money in figuring out property relations. Significant parts of the US Constitution were written to reflect those ideas. So there's a sense in which like America is as it is because of a philosopher. So these ideas, like progress in philosophy is hard to measure because it's not like we've developed a new technique for heart transplants or a new iPhone, or like here's a new app or something like that. Like it's a much less measurable progress, but I think the progress is there.
Oh, okay. So this is another question that I didn't really know what to make of. So I guess here goes. Do our imaginations have epistemic value? And what does this mean exactly?
Yeah. I used to think about this question a lot. And I used to want to say no. I used to be very, very, very skeptical about any epistemic role for imagination. Partly this is because, so if anyone sort of like does any work in metaphysics, and particularly like the metaphysics of modality, so about like possibility, necessity, impossibility and whatnot, often claims of possibility are made on the back of claims of conceivability. Like, I can imagine X, and so X is possible. And there's a sense in which philosophers often think that, like, the imagination is our epistemic access point to possibilities. You know, if you think of, like, sense experience gives us access to what's actual. Well, how do I get access to what's possible?
I see.
Well, I have to use my imagination.
So abstractions, then, I guess I can think of.
Abstractions would be one way, but also just thinking like, I can imagine a cow with the head of a donkey. So maybe that's possible.
Yeah.
And I used to think that like, there's no epistemic value to this. I've really softened up on that perspective now, and I'm not even sure why I've softened up. Generally, I think my position is that I think our imaginations do have epistemic functions, but I think they're very limited.
Yeah, I'm not too sure what that means exactly. Like, what do we mean by epistemic value? Like, that's, I think, a better question, maybe.
But yeah, that's good. So generally, when I think of epistemic value as like, does it let us acquire true beliefs, and does it let us avoid false beliefs?
Yeah.
There are various other ways we can like cash out epistemic values, but I think those are the two central ones.
Okay, so then what I have to think of is basically whether my imagination adds anything that is sort of useful in the sense that it's applicable to my life.
Does your imagination let you acquire true beliefs? Does your imagination let you avoid false beliefs?
Yeah.
And I think that our imaginations do a bit of that, but I think they only do it in like a really limited capacity.
Yeah.
You know, like, so I think our imaginations are a little bit too bound up with things like our insecurities. You know, so like, we can get ourselves into like slightly distorted perspectives. I mean, like, I don't know, like, maybe just because of like experiences I've had, like, you know, when my girlfriend doesn't text me back after like a few hours, I start to like worry, and I start to imagine like all the things I'm scared that she's doing, and of course it turns out it's false. You know, there are like so many instances of our imagination is just kind of like getting away from us like that, and I think we need to be careful about their epistemic value. But there's some, it would seem to me too strong to say that there's no value there.
But I guess even if the things that you sort of like in a panicked state like would think would be happening in a sense or in a circumstance, I guess even if those weren't happening, the sort of thoughts that led you to believe that, I guess, would be of value to be able to like protect you, you know, and like, does that make any sense? Like,
for sure.
Even if worldly circumstances aren't the case, the fact that you're able to like consciously bring these things up, I guess, serves a purpose still. So even if I would think of like a turtle with a donkey head or something like that, that would still sort of prove like that I would still add some sort of value, I guess, to my life in a way that I have no idea about, maybe. But
yeah, this is so. What you're saying makes a lot of sense. I think it's a really, really, really interesting consideration to bring up. I also think it kind of So philosophy is, I think in its ideal sense, like philosophy should be relevant to our everyday lives. Like it should help us live better. And this is where like, you know, it starts to like break down the distinction between like philosophy and like therapy.
Mm.
And what your comment here really makes me think of like, well, I mean, it's like a lot of experiences I've had with my therapist, let's say, but like, there are all sorts of like mental operations that I have, both like, you know, imaginative and non-imaginative. And you're right that they all serve a purpose. They all serve some function. But those functions aren't necessarily good.
Mm-hmm.
Those functions aren't necessarily helpful to how I actually want to live my life. And so, you know, if we like, you know, let's take the like getting, you know, insecure about my girlfriend thing. Like, you know, we can think about that as like, well, maybe it's like, you know, the function that it's playing is this kind of like self-protective mechanism. Mm-hmm. Okay, cool. Well, if my self-protective mechanism leads me to, say, make a bunch of false accusations to my girlfriend, like push her away, like damage my capacity to engage in intimate relationships with people, it's not really serving the purpose that I want it to. So
I guess it would depend on like a certain value that we want it to serve in the first place.
That's right.
So then, I guess the question is like, what do I consider to be of value to my life? Is the first question that you want to ask, and then you can bring this.
I think that's right.
Okay, I see. Okay, I just like thought of this because I thought it would be a cool question to ask you. What do you think dreams should be interpreted, or do dreams have any meaning behind them? Or
I don't know. I've been thinking about this question since you sent me the email, and I don't know quite what I want to answer on it. So I think dreams are worth interpreting. I mean, I think if nothing else, we're gonna interpret them.
Yeah.
Like, we interpret everything. Like, we interpret the leaves in the bottom of our tea mug. So, like, we're gonna interpret our dreams. Do dreams tell us things? You know, is there value to interpreting our dreams beyond just, like, that was a fun exercise?
Yeah.
I think yes, but the easy answer there is a kind of instrumental answer. Like, engaging in interpreting your dreams makes you better able to interpret yourself generally, and like makes you less likely to be dogmatic about who you are. And like, I think that's good.
Yeah.
Is there an sort of intrinsic value to interpreting dreams? I don't know. I am open to the possibility that there are, but I will confess that I am skeptical. And I'm skeptical partly because of how... So it feeds into a kind of broader skepticism I have around mysticism and spirituality and occult stuff, which is always very close to philosophy. So for example, like, I use tarot cards. I have like I'm not very good at keeping it as daily, but like I try to have a daily practice of like pulling a tarot card at random and like, you know, reading it and reading its interpretation. And, you know, I like that exercise because like I can look at the card and I can like read what the card means, and I can think like, does this speak to anything in my life or not? And sometimes the answer is nope. Like,
yeah.
But usually I can find like, I can kind of see like, I can, and like, you know, it gets me to think about something in my life. And then I have friends who use the tarot cards as kind of like a system of divination. You know, like predicting the future and of telling themselves what to do, how to respond. And that I really don't like. And the reason why I don't like it is because I think it's a way in which people give up their own agency. And I generally am very I don't think it's good for people to give up their own agency. Like, I don't think it's good for, like, I don't know, I remember I was 18 and, like, my girlfriend at the time, you know, we were, like, we kept, like, breaking up and getting back together, and we were having this, like, on and off again thing, and then, like, one day she was, like, basically she said to me, like, I had this, like, experience from which I divined that, like, we shouldn't be together. And I'm like, okay, like, that's, like, great and everything, but, like,
really?
Do you want to not be like, what do you want? Like, don't give me this fucking, like, don't defer your agency onto some higher power. Tell me what you want and why. And I am looking to be disabused of this notion. I am looking to be disabused of the idea that the use of dreams or tarot or anything as a system of divination isn't just a way of giving up your own agency. Because it seems to me that it consistently
Do you think there could ever be like an intrinsic want or like need to give off to give your agency to the control of someone else, or like an authority, or like, because it seems like there would be, to my intuition at least, of some people, I guess, would. Like, I don't want to, like, sort of claim that I know what's best for people, or, like, I don't think society knows what's best for people, but I think sometimes maybe, like, what's your take on this? What do you think of authority in general?
Well, I'm an anarchist, so I don't like authority, and I generally think that we should try and structure our society such that there are as few authority relationships as possible. And so, like, you know, this is something that I think about as a teacher. You know, like, teachers have, you know, I have a lot of authority as a teacher. You know, I have a lot of power over you guys as students. And I think a lot about my authority as a teacher, and I think a lot about how to exercise that authority. And there's a sense in which there's nothing I can do to entirely dissipate that authority. Like, I mean, if you introduced me as, like, you know, your epistemology professor. Like, technically, I'm not a professor. Like, I'm just an instructor. But, you know, like, you guys are all very kind enough to, like, call me professor, and, like, you know, you guys give me a kind of deference that I just get by virtue of standing at the front of the lecture theatre, and, you know, my name is the name at the top of the syllabus saying this is the instructor. And in my teaching practice, I actually work very hard to dissolve the authority and the hierarchy there as much as I possibly can. Obviously, I have some authority, and there's some kind of hierarchy there because I know more philosophy than you guys. You know, I just do. Like, I've just been doing it longer. And so, you know, that gives me a kind of authority, and that is, in a sense, inescapable. But there are lots of things that I can do to mitigate that, and to not act from that position of authority, and to enable you guys, as students, to engage more equally in the class, to not just have to do what I tell you to do, but to, like, you know, have some input. You know, that ranges from things like, you know, like sending out, like, the midterm survey, or, like, you know, just like I'm frequently checking with, like, Cam and Steven to see, like, how discussion sections are going, if there's anything, like, I need to adjust based, like, on how you guys are in sections. So, you know, I'm always working to try and, like, have the teaching be responsive to, like, the needs of the students, such that whatever authority I have can be as little as possible. I don't want authority. And the reason why I don't want authority is because my experience has always been that you guys do better work and have a better time in the class if you don't feel like I am some authority figure over you, but if you feel like you're actually able to engage as somewhat equal participants in the class, that, like, you know, you're not just there to have me dump a bunch of facts onto you. But really, like, as much as possible, I want my role to just be, like, I want my role to be as minimal as possible. You know, I give you the content in the lectures. But then you have the content. Like, you know, you're the ones who can, like, ask questions about it, talk to each other about it, like, write essays about it. You know, obviously I have to, you know, we're in a university, so I have to assess you in some ways. You know, I try and do that in such a way that, like, you guys actually get something out of the assessment. You know, like, it's a valuable exercise to you while you're doing it. Not just for the grade you get out of it, but, like, you know, it gives you something in doing the assessment. I generally just think that authority is bad. Like, I think what authority does is it alienates us from ourselves. It alienates us from ourselves and it alienates us from each other. And I think that there are a lot of people who do want an authority over them. And I think that that's not great. Because it does seem to me like, you know, authoritarianism is where you get, well, I mean, like, right-wing politics are authoritarian. And if you think about what right-wing politics actually are, they are a politics of you stay in your box. Like, here's your box, here are the things that you get to do inside that box, and you don't get to go outside of that box. And that's really harmful for everyone who's in every box. And it, like, this kind of, like, loops back to, like, men are screwed over by patriarchy too. Yeah. You know, like, if you're a man who is supposed to stay in your box, then you're not supposed to access your emotions, except maybe anger. You know, you're supposed to be, like, hypersexual. You're supposed to, you know, there are all sorts of things that you're supposed to do. And so men who are trying to keep in their box become alienated from themselves. You know, become alienated from their emotions, become alienated from their experiences, and become alienated from other people.
Right.
So I really believe that authority is a terrible, terrible thing. Nonetheless, authority seems to be something that a lot of humans really want. And
do you think it can be dispensed with, or do you think it can be, like, minimized?
I think it can be minimized.
Yeah. But I guess another question following that would be, like, even if you did minimize your authority, you would still preserve a hierarchy, and that hierarchy is all that matters, because then nothing really changes.
That's the thing, yeah. I mean, I, like, you know, it's helpful that whatever hierarchy I exist in as an instructor is only a temporary hierarchy. You know, that makes it a little bit better. That's why I think, like, hierarchies of learning... So my understanding of anarchism generally is, like, it is the anarchists want to eliminate as much as possible unjust hierarchies. So then there's a question, you know, there's like two questions there, like, how much is what is possible and what is an unjust as opposed to a just hierarchy? And I think, like, hierarchies between student and teacher can be just hierarchies because they're kind of inevitable. Like, some people do know more than other people, but also they can be temporary because, you know, at the end of a class, like, let's say, like, at the end of your degrees in philosophy, or, like, you know, you guys do a philosophy degree, you do a master's and a PhD, you know as much as I know. There's no longer a hierarchy between us. So knowledge hierarchies are temporary, except where we design them to be more permanent. And, you know, insofar as, like, a knowledge hierarchy would be designed as permanent, I'd be like, that's bad. Like, let's get rid of the ways in which that is permanent.
Do you think that's because there's, like, an inherent corruption in everyone that, like, manifests itself upon, like, the achieving of a state of, like, perfect authority? Or, like, is that because you just dislike the fact that authority could be permanent, and that's, like, in itself sort of a bad thing?
I think it's the corruption point. I mean, I want to... This is a somewhat complicated point, and I probably don't have all the stones to, like, quite explicate it all, but, like, there's a way of thinking about the corruption of authority as sort of like humans, like I have the core of my person, the sort of like essential core of who I am. And then if I like exist too long at the top of an unjust hierarchy, that gets distorted and I become like this like corrupt individual. And then another way of looking at it is like, there is no core to my person. The person I am is just the values that I happen to hold and the actions that I undertake.
And then there's no limit to it, then you automatically sort of like...
Exactly. Yeah.
Be perceived as a corrupt individual because you're sort of oppressing everyone else with your...
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. And my worries always come down to like how this shapes the people that we are.
Yeah.
And thereby shapes the relationships that we have with each other.
Interesting. Okay. Okay. Can we accurately refer to the same things if we have different ontological views?
Yeah, that's a good question. What do you think?
I think no. I think we don't, when we have different ideas of what actually exists, I think there's no way we'd be able to refer to the same things, because it's as though the entire sort of spectrum of our available resources of tangibly being able to refer to things is completely like out of sync with one another.
Yeah.
And so when I try to think of a basketball, you think of the same basketball.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I pretty much agree with that answer. I mean, again, like, for me, the context in which I think of this stuff is like, trans issues. So like, when someone calls me a man versus like when I call myself non-binary, like, are we referring to the same thing? So obviously there's a trivial sense in which we are, like there's the same flesh and blood here, whatever. Okay, fine. But that's actually pretty uninteresting.
Yeah.
Like, because when someone calls me a man, they're bringing this whole framework of interpretation onto me that will interpret everything about me in that light.
Yeah.
And it's sort of this presumption, it's like, well, to cut into being crass about it, but like, you have a dick, and so like, this is what that means for me. And there's a sense, like when I say I'm like non-binary or like I'm a woman or whatever, the person who wants to call me a man might sort of think like, so are you saying you don't have a dick? And I'm like, no, that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is like what that body part means is very different to what it means in your conception of things, and like what my physical body means is very different in my conception of things to the person who wants to call me a man. So there's just a fundamental sense in which we are not referring to the same thing, and there's no commensurability between our experiences either. Like the fact that we're talking about the same lump of matter doesn't give us any way to resolve those perspectives.
What do you think about like confidence as a general like term? And because I feel like it plays a giant role in how you express yourself and whether you feel comfortable expressing yourself even. And so
I'm smiling just because it's interesting that you asked me that, just because I literally a week ago put in an application to become a member on a research project where I said like what I want to do is look at the role of confidence in identity.
Wow.
And particularly like epistemic confidence and sort of like what I call like existential confidence.
Yeah.
I think it plays a huge role. I think it plays an enormous role. I mean, if nothing else, like I can see the difference it makes in my life. Like from when I was a exceedingly unconfident person to who I am now, which is I'm a very confident person. Like I really have changed that aspect of myself in 10 years. And it just makes an enormous difference to how my life goes. At every level. Like at every level. So like, I don't know, maybe a way I can like explain this in a somewhat substantive way is sort of like, so when I came out to my parents and was like, hey, I'm trans, they were sort of like, I should say that, like I have a good relationship with my parents and they're very supportive. But initially they were not. And initially it was quite challenging. And one of the things that they both said was, so this is like back, so like early in my PhD. They were both like, why are you doing this now? Like, why not just wait until you've like got your PhD and got a job and then you can do this? And I'm like, I'm like, trigger warning or whatever, but like, I was like, because I'm going to kill myself if I like, because I'm not going to finish my PhD. I'm not going to get a job because I will be dead. So what I was trying to get them to see was like, okay, that's good. Like, it's all well and good to say like, oh, it'd be good if you could just like do these things to give you some kind of security such that then you can do this like frivolous thing with your identity. But like, actually doing those things requires a huge exercise of like self-confidence that I simply lacked. Like, you know, and you know, to it's like speak back to like the, you know, what is it, like get a job in philosophy, like to get jobs in the field that I'm working in requires me to be outgoing. You know, it requires me to sell myself. It requires me to network with people. It requires me to, like, you know, you don't get these jobs just by putting in an application form and going to an interview. And I knew, you know, I was very aware that I was not getting as much as I could get out of my life because I didn't feel comfortable enough in myself or confident enough in myself to engage with the world. And so I, you know, hid myself. I made myself smaller. I missed out on opportunities. And now that I, you know, have some confidence, I'm like, kind of you know, do the things that I know.
What do you think like generated that confidence?
For me, I mean, you know, well, I was going to give a very trite answer of like getting on hormones. That's part of it, like, and like, you know, I guess I like will spend a minute or two just like talking about that, just given the current political climate around like trans issues and whatnot. Like, you know, there are all these like, you know, lots of questions about like, oh, the like long-term effects of like hormone replacement therapy and like sort of like puberty blockers in kids and all this kind of stuff. And like, you know, there are good questions to ask about the physiological effects of hormone replacement therapy, particularly for like younger people. And, you know, there are good questions to ask about the effects of puberty blockers. Those questions always need to be framed within an understanding of the benefits of those treatments. And the benefits of those treatments are subjective psychological benefits. Within 5 days of starting HRT, and like I've talked to lots of other trans people, and we all report much a similar experience, I stopped wanting to die. Like this part of my internal monologue that was just like, things are bad, you're bad, you should, is like, it just gone. It's just gone. And I started to be able to like actually find experiences of joy in like the body that I had and like the person that I was. I think the thing that has really helped me develop confidence is not just that experience, but so, you know, Vancouver's like, it's very chill, it's very progressive, it's, you know, it's very accepting, but it is still virulently transphobic. And like, I have a very easy time existing here as a trans person, but it is not seamless. Like, it is not frictionless. And there are plenty of small and big scale moments where basically the external world has tried to make me feel pretty disgusting for doing this thing. But they can't. They can't succeed. Not with me, at least. Because, like, I know how good I feel. I know how happy this makes me. And so it doesn't matter what other people think of me. And doing this, by which I mean like publicly transitioning, has really just helped me realize the truth of the maxim, or like, it doesn't matter what people think about you. Like, it really doesn't. except insofar as they have political power.
Yeah.
But like on a day-to-day level, like I don't care if like all the like old ladies in Kitsilano like stare at me like open-mouthed and disgusted. Fuck them. They don't know. Like they don't know. And like having that level of security has made me confident.
Do you think you talk about happiness and joy? Do you think that sort of goes hand in hand with having meaning in your life, or does one sort of come before the other, or how did you find the relation? Is it because it's meaningful that you think it's happy, or think that it's joyful, or is it joy that it's giving your life meaning?
I think it's a bit of both. I guess I would like see it as a cyclical process. Well, yeah, like I see them as coming together, but they are usefully separable elements as well. So like I remember one point, like sort of like, I don't know, in like the first 6 months of my transition or something. And I was realizing, I was lying in bed and I was realizing that like I was struggling to get to sleep. And the reason I was struggling to get to sleep is I was too happy. I just felt too good in my body, and I was distracted by that. Like I wasn't like I was just lying in bed, like, nothing, no hanky panky, nothing going on. I was just like lying in bed. It's like, wow, I feel great, and like was just like thinking through of that, and I was like, man, I'm not really sleeping. It's like, oh right, it's because I feel good. And there wasn't really like a whole lot of like meaning there. It's just like a feeling of pleasure and joy. But of course, we're humans and we make meaning out of our experiences, so that very quickly becomes meaningful. And you know, those experiences are like they're part, you know, those kinds of experiences have like given me a sense of the meaningfulness of my life, but that sense of meaningfulness then loops back onto,
exactly, right. I think I experienced the opposite of that. I thought like because I'm doing this meaningful activity, like whatever, it's like studying for my courses and whatnot, then studying for my courses tends to make me happy because I'm pursuing something that I perceive as meaningful. And so you can't like it's
exactly.
It's an exact loop.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay, interesting. Oh wow. Okay, so yeah, this is an interesting one. How do we deal with unfalsifiable metaphysical modes of thinking and different interpretations that provide reasoning for the same identical worldly occurrences? Yeah, this is a tough one, I think.
It's a tough one, yeah. I think, I guess like kind of similar, my answer is very similar to, what I say about like, when I was saying about like legalization of drugs in the chat we were having before this recording. Once you're in the realm of different conceptions of things that may be unfalsifiable and incommensurable, I think you need to look at what their effects are and whether one or the other is causing harm. And whether the harm that's being caused is sort of appropriate or should be avoided. So, you know, again, you know, there's so much, you know, I always like tie this back to like trans stuff just because that's where most of my research on this comes out of, but like, does one's genitals determine one's gender? That's kind of an unfalsifiable claim. So there, you know, there are things that are falsifiable in this region, like all humans are either male or female. Like that's falsified. That turns out to be false. Like you know, human sex characteristics fall under my bimodal distribution, very intersex conditions. You know, like we are not actually a species that exhibits binary sex. But that's slightly distinct from the question of like, do your genitals determine your gender? I think no. Lots of people think yes. How do we reconcile these two positions? What possible thing could we appeal to in objective reality that's going to settle this question? I don't think there is anything.
Harm?
But what we can do is we can differentiate between the perspectives based on the harm that they caused. So well, we can look at, well, what does the framework according to which genitals determine gender do? Well, it hurts a lot of people. Not just trans people, but, it hurts trans people, it hurts intersex people, it hurts any gender non-conforming person, really. And what does the system according to which genitals don't determine your gender do? Well, it doesn't cause those kinds of harms. It's not to say it's entirely harmless. Yeah. Everything's got some kind of harm somewhere, unfortunately. I think, anyway. But it causes a lot less harm. And it enables some goods. And so I think that's a reason for favouring the position over the other position.
Okay.
And I guess one important thing to say there is that I don't think that's a concession. I don't think what we're doing there is conceding, sort of saying, genitals really determine your gender, but we're going to act like they're not.
Yeah.
The reality is that they don't. But it's a reality that we socially construct, basically.
Yeah. So I had a thought there. I'm going to play devil's advocate here for a second.
Please.
But what I was thinking of when we talked about harm just then was, I guess you could then say some people, or trans people or whatever, any other form of person that does not identify by a binary mode of sexuality or gender, you could say that, it's because they have the wrong beliefs that they experience the harm in the first place. And so if you just change your beliefs, then you would not experience harm. So why don't you just become, positivist people?
For sure, yeah. And so, there are some of our beliefs do seem like we're able to change them like that. So, if I have a bunch of, let's say some of my, political beliefs, it seems like, while they might be quite deeply held, I can change them. If I was, let's say, a Nazi, I could stop being a Nazi. I could stop believing in the things that made me ascribe to those positions and start believing in other things. And that might take me some time, and it might take me some work, and it might even be uncomfortable. But I could do it. But if I was gay, what do I need to do to stop being gay? And we look at conversion therapy, and conversion therapy both doesn't work and is torture. So there's a sense in which I'm my answer is it's the harms again. The harms that are associated with getting people to change those sorts of beliefs seem to me to be, it does seem like the processes typically don't work, the beliefs don't really get changed. But also the harms that are caused by trying to get people to change those beliefs about themselves outweigh whatever benefits might come from them fitting into society, as it were.
I think that answers that pretty well. Okay. I think that was it. But I also added this small question mark in the end about vainness, because I'm just really interested in that in general in my life right now.
Sure.
And because I thought as though, in Evan's course as well, we talk about in Buddhist thinking, there's a lot of emphasis on how everything, how your thoughts essentially shape your reality, and how basically it's like a folly thing to do for one to cling to things that are essentially removable from you, or that can be taken away from you. And so there's multiple ways of, I guess, interpreting that. But what I'm mainly trying to decide for myself is at least that maybe I should control my thoughts better, is what I'm I'm trying to basically assert and apply to my own life.
Yeah. And
I think that that's proven to affect everything else that I've tried to address after that And so the question, I guess, would then be is, should I, if I'm experiencing distress, how do I decide whether the distress that I'm experiencing is worthwhile or not? And I guess that's that's one of the questions that I have right now, at least. happen.
Yeah. That's a tricky question.
Yeah, how do you know if something is good for you? I guess would be a similar question.
Well, I suppose one thing, I don't think we can assess these things in any given moment. So we have to see how these parts of ourselves allow us to play out our lives and whether they let us do the things that we want to do. So it's kind of like going back to like the question of like, does my like jealousy and self-defense mechanisms from my romantic relationships, like, is that good for me or not? Well, I can see a function that it's playing, but does that function that it's playing, like, how well does that function line up with the broader, like, goals and projects I have for myself as a person? If I'm a person who, like, wants romantic relationships, does my drive to self-protect help that goal or ultimately hinder that goal?
Or even if you would want a relationship, is an active seeking of a relationship,
right? Yeah.
Right, like the actual best outcome for your desire, then, like,
indeed, yeah. So I'm not sure how we tell when things are good for us. I think it's very difficult. I think it's something that we often get wrong. I think even when we get it right, I think it's something that we have a very hard time acting upon. So, like, for instance, I, like, recently-ish, like, ended a romantic relationship, and, like, I knew I needed to end the relationship. It was very, very hard. Like, it took me a long time to do it, because I didn't want to, even though I knew it was good for me. I, like, have a therapist who I've been seeing for years, and, like, I'm still discovering things about myself, and some of those things are like, oh, that's a good, that's a helpful part of me, and then some it's like, oh, I really should work on that part and, like, try and get it out of me. So, I don't know, there's this metaphor that you might have come across. I think it's called von Neumann's raft. It's this idea that, what we want and hope for is an ability to sort of, like, starting from zero, what kind of person should I be? How do I want to live my life? All this kind of stuff. And that's just not the situation that we're in. We're not in a situation where we're on land in a dry dock building a boat from scratch. Our situation starts already in the middle of the ocean, already on a raft. Yeah. And we just have to repair and build the raft as we go. I do think that's kind of our situation. It's like, I don't think there's any way in which, we can't get outside of ourselves. I can, like, go to my therapist and I can, like, ask my therapist for sort of, like, tell me what to do. But I have to accept, when they say, well, you should do X, Y, and Z, I have to then go, like, okay, I accept that I will do X, Y, and Z, and maybe I won't.
Yeah.
So there is no starting from zero with ourselves. And that makes the evaluation of ourselves quite difficult, because I don't think there's any sense in which we can, like, except for, like, very few moments, like, it's hard to see any one part of yourself and see that, like, well, that's a good part of it.
Yeah,
that's a bad
it increasingly seems like everyone, or like me, like any person, always takes, like, a leap of faith when attempting to, like, decide on what they want to pursue. It's always the case that you have.
Yeah,
Or is there any merit to, like, to going for the numbers then? To try to, even so, if you have no idea and if you're just stranded in the middle of the raft in the middle of the ocean, is there any sensibility in just following through with whatever's available in your environment, or should you then create your own?
I think it's always important to create your own, if that's what you want to do. I don't think that, but I don't think that because I can never know what I want, I should just do anything and everything. So like, you know, like right now I know that like I don't want to learn how to play golf, let's say. And you know, there's a sense in which like, well, do it like maybe if I like started playing golf and I like learn that I like it and blah, 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 but I'm like, yeah, but given the person that I am, like given the things that I like, if I wanted to learn golf, I'd have to like give something up because I'm really busy and like I don't want to give anything up, and like I don't value the sorts of values that I associate with golf, so I don't want to become a person who has those values. I think that's perfectly fine. Like I don't think that's irrational of me.
Yeah.
Even if there's some like, you know, there's no objective sense to who I am and I could become anything, and so there's a sense in which like rationally I could do anything.
Yeah.
I think it's rational, like, well, given, like, I am the kind of person that I am, and, like, it's okay to have the preferences that I have, basically.
So then the number, the amount of people pursuing anything doesn't make a difference then in that sense. It's just,
kinda, yeah.
You have to, you would be better off, I guess, projecting your own intrinsic sort of reality onto the world.
So, yeah.
Okay. Well, that was the end of my questions.
Cool. No,
Thank you so much for agreeing to do this.
Of course, yeah. It was a pleasure.
Yeah. Okay. So wrapping it up then.